You know, I think you're going to see more of this, actually. I think you'll see much more of it. And you got countries like Peru, the number 3 largest producer of silver in the world, or excuse me, of silver in the world. And China came and built a deep water port there. I mean, are they thinking, geez, what's next? And you've got, of course, Mexico, who's number 1 producer of silver that Trump came out and openly threatened. 100%, man. I think you have to, because, you know, you go from a perspective of protecting your borders and protecting your sovereignty into perhaps going across that Rubicon and doing things that have, in many respects, created the BRICS, or at least the rallying cry that supports it, and the de-dollarization that the United States and their hegemony, perhaps from their perspective, that we are the destabilizing force, not the force for good coming from a moral high ground that you could argue we've kind of trampled upon. And I was listening to Gerald Celente about this the other night. And again, I think the key, Jay, is to listen and to if you never listen to other viewpoints, if you never broaden your mind in terms of listening to both sides of an argument, you never grow. And I like what Gerald had to say. He said, you know, look, can you only imagine? Now, granted, you know, Maduro, a narco kingpin, maybe not in a duly elected president, but you could say really kind of the same thing about Zelensky not being duly elected, and he closed down the election or the voting and election process during time of war. So he's not the duly elected president, or shouldn't be. And yet, can you imagine if Putin came in and took he and his wife and brought them back for whatever their reasons are, or she did the same thing in Taiwan? Oh my God, the outrage. And it was interesting. You know, he said, you know, look, listen to what George Washington said at his farewell address, that is, stay out of foreign entanglements. And I don't like being the world's policeman. I think it's a problem. And when you start to go further than that and threaten countries like Mexico and threaten countries like Cuba, and, you know, start bombing in Iran, start bombing in Nigeria, you're bombing in Syria, you know, at what point does this begin to have effects on the way that the world looks at the United States, the way that the world looks at the U.S. Treasury market, the way that the world looks at the dollar? And I think we're crossing that line, or already have, to where it is something that I think is perhaps destabilizing. And you can say all you want about the fact that, you know, he was bringing drugs, or supposedly bringing drugs into the country. But in essence, we went and we kidnapped a sitting president, right, wrong, or indifferent. And I think that's something that, you know, I think will have ramifications. And all of these countries who are resource rich and maybe emerging nations, underdeveloped in South America, are starting to think very hard about, you know, their allegiance to the BRICS nations or their allegiance to the United States. Do they want to sell their oil or their commodities for yuan? Do they want to be part of the Belt Road? Do they want to be part of the BRICS? These are things that I think are coming more into focus as we see the United States flex its muscle. And I don't think everyone across the globe agrees with it. I think the exact same thing. You know, the pushback to that would be that it was the Western oil companies that built the infrastructure, and they went back on their deal after he took power. Yeah. Okay, fine. But I look at that angle and I agree. And then I look at it from another angle and say, well, you know, that was coercion or with force. But how about what's going on in Nigeria, who is a member of the BRICS as an observation partner? They applied, they were admitted, but not a full partner yet, but a BRICS plus observation partner. And they're the largest producer of oil in Africa. Now, they came in a cooperative manner, supposedly, with the government from Nigeria to help bomb ISIS, who was persecuting the Christians. Now, they've been doing this for a long time. Is there something bigger there? And I would think there are, in all of these policy decisions, that there is a story and then there is a deeper reality. And in both cases, you're looking at countries that are threatening to change or sell their oil in yuan, and even worse than that, over payment rails that are not compatible with the SWIFT, whether it be the SIPS, the cross-border payment system, or whether it be even the bridge technology, the former M-Bridge, which is now just called the bridge. That is operational now and is being used, albeit limitedly, or on a limited basis, it is something that I think is probably much deeper than what the cover story is. And that's exactly right. I mean, Saddam and Gaddafi both threatened one to pay for oil in, I think it was the gold and dinar that they wanted to use, and the other in euro. And I think that there is probably some real validity to that statement. And that's why, there's duality in every story. That is true. But I think, to your point, what you're hedging towards is, to me, this was kind of a shot across the bow to the BRICS. And that's exactly right. And, I think you're going to see more of this, actually. I think you'll see much more of it. And you got countries like Peru, the number 3 largest producer of silver in the world, of silver in the world. And China came and built a deep water port there. I mean, are they thinking, geez, what's next? And you've got, of course, Mexico, who's number 1 producer of silver that Trump came out and openly threatened. Cuba has applied to the BRICS. So you have all of these threats that are on the face, on the cover, talking about the way that they deal with drugs and the way that those drugs are finding their way into the United States. But in reality, is it something much deeper than that? Is it, they're starting to feel the pressure of countries wanting to break free from the Western system and from accepting or paying for energy and commodities in US dollars. And you look at what this new system is that they're doing, and it is definitely sidestepping settlement for energy, not in dollars, but in local currencies, and using gold as a replacement for reserves held traditionally in treasuries. And when you start to get real serious about it, public about it, I think that's probably, killing 2 birds with 1 stone type of thing. That I think there is truth into what you're hedging at. And I completely and totally agree. In fact, that's kind of what I've been talking about for the last 6 years. Flexing your muscle. But I think it gets to a point where you talk the Monroe Doctrine. So what are we doing in the South China Sea? What are we doing in the Straits of Hormuz or in the Gulf? What are we doing in everyone else's affairs? But, you could argue the same thing about Iraq. We went there 22 years ago looking for weapons of mass destruction, never found them, but we're still there occupying the country.
When people ask me whether the world is really shifting away from the Western order, I tell them, just look at what's happening right in front of your eyes. It's not subtle anymore. It's not theoretical. It's not something that requires a PhD in geopolitics to decode. It's happening openly, loudly, and with a kind of momentum that would have been unthinkable even 5 years ago. And yet, most Americans, good, hard-working people, are too distracted by the noise at home to realize the magnitude of the shift underway. They think Trump threatening Mexico, or flexing around Venezuela, or even talking about Greenland is just political theater. But viewed through the eyes of the BRICS nations, and the Global South, and the emerging commodity giants, this isn't theater. This is a warning shot, a signal, a Rubicon being crossed. Because what happens when the world's largest debtor nation, desperately clinging to the privileges of its reserve currency, starts using military muscle rather than monetary diplomacy? Exactly what you'd expect. The world begins to look for the exit doors. And, frankly, can you blame them? Peru, the 3rd largest silver producer in the world, has been quietly watching the United States stumble through crisis after crisis while China builds them a deep water port. Now ask yourself, what signal does that send to Peru? Whose partnership looks more reliable? More long-term? More strategic? It's a clue about the future, and anyone involved in precious metals needs to be paying attention. And then, of course, there's Mexico, the number 1 producer of silver on Earth. Trump openly threatened them, loudly and repeatedly. Now, whether the stated reasons involve narcotics, organized crime, or border security, you have to recognize that for a sovereign nation whose economy is deeply intertwined with natural resources, there is a deeper calculation happening. They're watching the United States weaponize trade, weaponize currency, and now weaponize enforcement on foreign soil. And they're asking, do we hitch our wagon to a declining hegemon, or do we start looking toward a rising multipolar world aligned with BRICS Plus and China's infrastructure networks? This is the real question that keeps these governments up at night. And yes, part of that anxiety comes from watching the US effectively kidnap the sitting president of Venezuela. Now, whether that president is a hero or a narco kingpin, as some claim, is beside the point. The point is, imagine if Putin marched into Ukraine and dragged away Zelensky and his wife under the justification of political corruption. The Western outrage would be biblical. CNN would interrupt every cooking show, every rerun, every commercial, and put breaking news banners up for 48 hours straight. But when we do it, when the US flexes that muscle, somehow it's supposed to be different. And that gets us right into what Gerald Celente was talking about, and he's absolutely right. You cannot grow as an individual or as a country without listening to viewpoints that challenge your worldview. But most Americans have been insulated from the consequences of US foreign policy for decades. We don't feel what other nations feel. We don't see what they see. We don't worry about what they worry about. We don't understand how destabilizing it is when a country at the center of the global financial system behaves unpredictably. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. We are no longer viewed as the stabilizing force we once were. We are increasingly seen as the destabilizing force. And that perception has consequences, especially for a country whose entire economic system depends on the world continuing to buy its debt. Meanwhile, look at Nigeria, one of the largest oil producers in Africa and now a BRICS observation member. The official story says the US is cooperating militarily with Nigeria to help combat ISIS and protect Christian communities. A noble cause, right? But step back, zoom out, and ask, why now? Why Nigeria? Why the country that has openly signaled interest in selling oil for UN? Why the country participating in payment systems that bypass SWIFT, including China's CES and the new bridge network replacing MBridge? Whenever geopolitical narratives have a shiny, feel-good wrapper, always look underneath. Because the deeper reality is that the United States is sensing the fracture of dollar hegemony, and it is responding not with monetary reform, not with domestic strengthening, not with fiscal discipline, but with pressure, strategic pressure, diplomatic pressure, and occasionally military pressure. And this is exactly what creates the kind of rallying cry the BRICS nations have been waiting for. Think back to Saddam Hussein. What was his final economic sin? Threatening to sell oil for euros. Think back to Muammar Gaddafi. What was his unacceptable policy? Advocating for a gold-backed African dinar. We can debate the morality, but we cannot debate the pattern. The Western financial system is built on one foundational truth. Oil must settle in dollars. Commodities must settle in dollars, and any deviation from that system is treated as a threat. Now fast forward to today. The BRICS nations are openly building a new settlement system that bypasses the dollar entirely. Local currencies for trade, gold as the reserve settlement asset, payment rails outside SWIFT. The single greatest threat to US financial supremacy since Bretton Woods. And what do? We threaten Mexico. We intervene in South America. We send warships into the South China Sea. We conduct airstrikes in Syria. And we stretch the Monroe Doctrine to its outer limits. And in doing so, we validate the perception that the United States is no longer the benevolent empire of the post-World War II era, but a cornered empire clinging to power by coercion. And once that perception takes hold, nations with commodities, silver, oil, copper, lithium, begin asking whether the United States is a long-term partner or a short-term liability. Let me give you a real-world example. Peru watched China build a massive port, the largest Chinese investment in the Americas. Not because China loves ceviche, but because China understands that controlling supply chains is more important than controlling aircraft carriers. They understand that the future of global power will be determined by who secures commodities. Silver, gold, copper, these are the building blocks of the next century. You think China doesn't see the writing on the wall for silver? They're hoarding it like it's the last lifeboat on the Titanic. They've been buying refined silver, processing global dory bars, absorbing scrap, and locking down mining partnerships for the past 20 years. And now, when silver hits triple digits and industrial demand explodes and Western inventories collapse, what does China do? It tightens exports. It prioritizes internal supply. The West screams shortage, but the truth is China isn't withholding. China is simply keeping what already belonged to them through decades of strategic accumulation. And while all this is happening, the United States keeps printing money at a pace that would make Weimar economists blush. Our debt markets are trembling. Long-term treasury yields are surging. Foreign governments are dumping bonds. Gold is ripping higher because it's not gold rising, it's the dollar falling. And silver is doing what silver always does when the monetary system enters the acceleration phase. It stops behaving like a commodity and starts behaving like a monetary escape hatch. On social media, you see comments like, "Silver is overbought," "The rally is unsustainable," or my favorite tweet of the week, "Silver is in a bubble. Sell now before it collapses back to $25. That tweet aged like milk in the sun. There is no bubble when the world's largest governments are shifting to hard asset reserves. There is no bubble when industrial demand exceeds global production. There is no bubble when the West is fighting a monetary war with the East and losing.